All right, welcome everybody. This is week 2, and this is Financial Foundations. Hopefully you're finding the stuff on the Great Depression interesting. And we're going to be adding to what we talked about last week with more information about the role of government. We talked about the Federal Reserve Bank last week and how the banking system is put together. We talked about fractional reserve banking, things of that sort, how money is distributed in our economy. But we're going to be talking more about the concept of supply and demand this week, how that affects companies, government, consumers. But today is really going to be mostly about how government does what it does in America, how it spends money, how it collects money, how those decisions are made. So if you're in your classwork stream, you would have seen this role of government, budgeting, taxation pop in there with 4 different documents in it. We're going to start off with this first one on the role of government. And it's got a simple question: how involved should the government be? You got 2 people that are small business owners. The first guy is a Mr. Salter. He believes that new refrigerators would help him save on energy costs, and he thinks the government plays too big of a role in the economy. Okay, well, that's pretty clear. He wishes he didn't have to pay so much money for taxes and things like business licenses. Well, sure, taxes are inevitable, right? Death and taxes, those are the 2 certainties in our lives. The second business owner, Karen Hicks, has a car wash down on the south side. This is not a real example, but it could be. She doesn't like the taxes that she has to pay, but she appreciates many government services she gets for her taxes. She got lots of information from the SBA, which is the Small Business Administration, to help her business succeed. They gave her advice on getting a loan to start her business. She thinks the government should do whatever it can to improve business in her community and the country as a whole. She would not mind at all if the government took an even larger role. Okay, 2 very different opinions about government involvement. Can anybody give me an example, a recent example of government involvement in business? No suggestions? You guys really need to be watching the news. Watch CNN. Get on a news site online. Have you heard of the Paycheck Protection Program? Have you heard of the economic stimulus packages that have been approved by Congress? Well, if you haven't, you got some catching up to do, because this has been going on for months during the pandemic. And the government has gotten directly involved in business operations by providing these short-term loans and other incentives to help people stay employed. Paycheck Protection Program. Some people really hate that. They think it's a direct subsidy to business. They think, well, you know, this is a free market economy. If the business can't survive, then that's too bad. Well, what happens in an extremely unusual situation like we have right now? What happens to the businesses that go under? What happens to those employees? Where do those employees go? They still got bills to pay. They got families to support.
Unemployment.
Unemployment, yeah, they're going to go on unemployment. So our government in the last year has made the decision, let's try to help keep businesses alive, keep them going. In one sense, it's cheaper for the government to do that than it is to deal with all the people that are on unemployment, that would go on unemployment if these businesses failed. Now, there have been a lot of layoffs, and a lot of people have had to go on unemployment. Well, what's the other thing that's happened as a result of with our unemployment system?
Nobody wants to go back to work.
I'm sure that's true. Say again, Sarah? I can't understand what you're saying. They send them a check? That is not quite what I was thinking about, but yes, in fact, most of the time it's going to be done by direct deposit. It's going to be done electronically. So you won't even actually get a paper check. But has the unemployment system been running smoothly? No, not at all. Been thousands and thousands and thousands of people have had to file for unemployment. And so there's backlogs. Again, this is on. Some people aren't even getting it because the backlog is so severe. The government doesn't have the people and the systems in place to handle all of the claims. And the biggest problem, though, is not that. The biggest problem is the scammers, the people that are filing fake unemployment compensation claims. They are stealing millions and billions of dollars from the government by filing false claims. If you think about people that are victims of identity theft, what do? They have probably got their social security number taken. Well, that's all you need to go file unemployment. Figure out where they work, go look on social media, do a quick Google search. Oh, I got their social security number and I got their place of employment. File a claim. Government does not have enough people to check all those. So there's been a lot of problems through this pandemic where the government's tried to fix, but has been overwhelmed with. So that may color, that kind of situation is unique, really, because nothing like this has happened, especially since the Great Depression, and that was a complete economic collapse worldwide. The same thing is, a lot of the same sorts of things have happened here during the pandemic and elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of places in Europe, for instance, that are still under very heavy restrictions. So go down a couple paragraphs. Because the United States is a democracy, the role of the government in the economy can change if the majority of the voters want it to change. Well, we just had a highly contentious presidential election. You went from a Republican president to a Democratic president. Very much a different philosophy. So it goes on to say voters may decide to increase or decrease taxes. Government may choose to spend a greater amount on jails or highways than on anti-poverty programs and the arts, or vice versa. Government collects a lot of tax money, they spend a lot of tax money. Does our government collect enough tax money to cover all of its costs? No, it does not. Thanks, Sarah. The United States, and maybe this is true elsewhere, but the United States is involved in deficit spending. Our government has to go borrow money to pay for the programs that it doesn't collect enough taxes on. Why would we do that? Why don't we just cut programs? Remember, we're talking about elected officials here making those decisions. There's two things that can happen. They can raise taxes or they can cut programs. But what do? Do our elected officials do either one of those things? Some would argue that they don't do it enough. Because who's affected when they do that? Elected officials historically do not like to be associated with raising taxes. Nobody wants to pay higher taxes. Nobody. If they turn around and start saying, well, this program and that program are non-essential, we don't need to continue to fund those, who's going to be affected? Whoever benefits from that program is going to be affected. Those people are voters. They're employees, potentially going to end up on unemployment. So raising taxes and cutting programs, neither one of those are going to be popular with the voters. Next, the last paragraph. In the United States, growth in the government has been the overall trend since the 1930s. Okay, what was happening in the 1930s? If you don't know, you should be looking at those other assignments. That was in the 1940s. World War II was in the 1940s. What led up to that? If you haven't done the assignment on the Great Depression, the very first assignment, you won't be able to answer this question. There's reading that goes with that, talks about the business cycle and about what was going on in the country that led to the Great Depression and what ultimately got us out of that. The Great Depression lasted for 10 years. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, he was the president that got elected in 1932. He came up with a set of programs. They decided finally the federal government needed to be more involved in solving these problems. They weren't just going to leave it to the public, to the private sector and let business handle everything. Because what was the first thing that happened that led to the Great Depression? What was it that collapsed? The stock market collapsed in 1929, right? People lost their life savings. Businesses went bankrupt. Stockbrokers in New York were jumping out of buildings, killing themselves. And nobody suddenly had any money. Banks closed. Everybody ran to the banks to pull their money out. They panicked. There was no government system in place. So after several years of that, poor Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge, those two presidents, Coolidge, he got out of there. He was thinking everything was rosy in the 20s. They called it the Roaring 20s. Hoover came in, everything went in the tank. He got voted out by FDR. FDR is the only U.S. president that's ever been elected 4 times. People loved him so much, loved his programs, the New Deal programs. They built bridges, they built reservoirs, they built libraries, they built highways, they put people back to work. That was the start of a lot of these large government spending programs. In this example, you got two small business owners. At some point, you guys are going to have to make decisions. about politicians based on what they believe in and what you believe in. Do they believe the same way that you do? Should government be less involved? Well, that means they need to lower taxes or cut programs. Well, who's going to do that? Find a candidate that will, and you'll probably support him. If you think the government should do more, then there's candidates out there that'll do that. The problem with all of that, though, is with deficit spending. I'm going to pause this for just a second to find something to show you guys. Okay, if you look at what I have shown on the screen here, it says U.S. debt clock. Anything strike you when you first look at this? Look in the upper left-hand corner, that box in the upper left segment of this graphic. U.S. national debt. Look at those numbers fly by. That's an awfully big number. Yes, these are live calculations. So that would be 573 million. That would be 165 billion. So this is 28 trillion, 165 billion, 573 million and counting. What? Yeah. That's the amount of money that the United States government owes banks and the world. The U.S. national debt, DEBT, that the debt is a loan. 30% of the federal budget comes from borrowing money. And most of the time, we're only paying the interest on those loans. Look over here in this green box, U.S. federal tax revenue. Each year, $3,481 billion. Well, what did Congress just approve for stimulus funding? Was it 3 trillion or was it a trillion? I don't remember the exact number. It was $3 trillion, some crazy high number. Well, they didn't raise taxes to do that. So where's that money coming from? That money is coming from borrowing. It's adding to our national debt. At some point, people are gonna start getting concerned about this. How do you pay this much money off? Nobody wants to raise taxes to the level that's necessary to do that. This is a very ticklish problem that our elected officials have to deal with. And we elected them, so until the voters start to get concerned, you know, how is it going to change? I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to it. Maybe your generation will do a better job of it. But it didn't just start overnight either. This goes back to really the Great Depression, 90 years ago, basically, when the federal government started to expand into a lot of sort of employment programs. How do they track it so well? That's a good question, which honestly I don't have the answer to, Jess. I will look at that though. Anybody have any other questions or comments? Jess asked me. Just asked me how this is tracked so well, and I am going to try to find that answer for next time. So the rest of this roll of government handout, we're going to do a modification, a modified version of this. There is a separate handout titled Letter to the President. Kind of looks like this last page of the roll of government sheet. If you were concerned about how things are going and you wanted to write the president a letter saying, hey, I think you're doing a great job with this, but I really think the money needs to be spent in XYZ area, not in ABC area. That's the exercise. So you may have some ideas about this, but first you got to think about where the money is being spent today. And that's what we're going to look at next. But if you look down here under this section titled Directions, fiscal policy. I'm going to highlight that in yellow. Very, very important term. You'll be tested on this. You have to know what it means when somebody talks about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is all about taxation. And who's involved in taxation in the federal budget? The president starts the budget process, and then Congress must approve it. And then it comes back to the president as an approved budget that he signs into law. The federal budget actually becomes a law.
I'm sorry, how do you spell that? I can't see it.
Fiscal, fiscal. Sounds like physical, but it's fiscal. Make it a little bigger.
Thank you.
Now, the reason that I'm pointing that out and emphasizing that is because the very next definition says monetary policy. Totally different. Monetary policy is about money. That's what we talked about last week with the Federal Reserve Bank. Monetary policy is about how much cash is actually floating around in our economy. The Federal Reserve Bank makes those decisions, not Congress, not the president. So those two policies, you got to be sure that you understand the difference between the two. Because they make a huge difference in how your understanding of government itself in our economy will play out. Fiscal policy is about taxes, government spending, and government budgeting. Monetary policy is about the Fed, the Federal Reserve. When I say the Fed, that's usually the nickname that they're given. Below that are some suggested topics. If you're not involved in this normally, you don't think about it, and maybe you don't. You're not business owners yet. Maybe you're just starting off in your career. You don't have families. You're not really concerned about some of these big picture issues, and you don't even know what to write about. Well, here's some. Some ideas. Unemployment. You think it's too high? Well, how are they going to fix it? So you might have to do a little research on what the unemployment rate is. What's the trend been over the last year or so? Is it trending in a good direction, or are more and more people becoming unemployed? Are you concerned about inflation? Are prices too high? Might have to do some research on that. What is the current inflation rate? Do you know what trade deficit is? Do you think our trade deficit is a problem. Huh. It says we have a trade deficit. What does that mean? Trade deficit. Deficit means we're in the hole, right? We're in the red. So when we're talking about national trade, trade deficit is actually an international concern because it means that we are importing more products than we are exporting. We have a deficit. When we're importing, we're spending money on stuff that other countries are selling to us. So that our cash is leaving the country to buy stuff that other countries are producing. Who's one of the biggest trade partners that we have right now? China. Huge. China also happens to own a lot of the debt that our government issues. So when you start talking about things like tariffs, like our last president did, it's aimed at certain countries to make their products more expensive. Well, tariffs historically have not worked. It's a tax on imports. It tells you, it shows you basically that people are still going to buy the products that they think are better, even if it's a higher price. And that's all really a tariff does. It raises the price on products that we need to buy. If the US companies aren't producing it and producing quality products, we're going to buy it from somewhere if we need it. It's a market economy, free market economy. Anybody's free to come buy and sell their goods here. If we had a trade surplus, we would be selling more US products to other countries around the world. That means that money would be coming into us, and that would be a good thing. So there's a trade deficit currently. How can you fix that? What would you do if it was your decision? Or if you were in the president's cabinet and you were an economic advisor, what would you recommend to him to do? We just looked at the national debt clock. That's another one of these potential topics that you could choose if you wanted to. Is our national debt too high? What are you going to do to fix it, Mr. President? Well, some people right now would argue we got bigger fish to fry, bigger issues to handle since we still haven't climbed out of this pandemic yet. The virus is still out there. So that's the overriding concern probably for most people right now. If you don't see something on there that you like, then come up with your own topic. Maybe you'd like to see more money spent on schools. Maybe you'd like to see more money available for students to cut the cost of college so more people could go to college. I think that's a huge issue. It's become almost so bad that, you either go into massive debt as a student and get student loans, or you got to come from a wealthy family. That's going to be tough to manage over time. Or you can go to the military. Yeah.
Well, I was talking about since my dad served. If you're like if your family, like your dad serves, you get tuition off.
Oh, through the GI Bill? Yeah. And that's a huge incentive for a lot of people to go into the military. They can get training, maybe even eventually come out and get your own tuition or your family's tuition paid for or partially paid for through the GI Bill, veterans benefits and that sort of thing. We don't want to become a country of the haves and the have-nots, and especially not around education, in my opinion. The more education people can have access to, the better off we'll be, I think, in terms of the world. Questions? Any other questions or comments on that? All right. So the next thing we're going to look at here is this one that says copy of federal budget. Sometimes these links change. But this is a good.
Are you overwhelmed by
it's
all
a
the
good
information
video.
and options?
This is a really good video to help explain the difference between monetary and fiscal policy.
Hello, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're finally going to talk about a topic I know that you've all been waiting for, monetary and fiscal policy. Hooray! You haven't been waiting for monetary and fiscal policy? Are you sure? I've been talking it up for weeks, you know? Well, let me see if I can't convince you to be as excited as I am. Monetary policy! Woo! Fiscal policy! Yeah! I want to get fiscal. Come on and get Okay, let's start the show. Let's start with monetary policy because it's not at all controversial. Well, it kind of is controversial, but it's less contentious than fiscal policy. Monetary policy is basically the way the government regulates the amount of money in circulation in the nation's economy. Controlling the money supply is the primary task of the Federal Reserve System. And since it's a little bit complicated, I'm going to talk about the other things that the Fed does first. Federal Reserve System was created in 1913 to serve as America's central bank. Before then, there were state and local banks, as well as a Bank of the United States, which was a much more limited central bank. The Fed is made up of 12 regional banks and 2 boards, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, who are appointed by the President, and the Federal Open Market Committee, which is partially appointed by the President. The Fed has 2 primary tasks: to control inflation and to encourage full employment. And it has 4 basic functions, but one of them is way more important than the others. The Fed is responsible ultimately for clearing checks and for supplying actual currency, most of which is kept in highly secure facilities staffed by robots with laser eyes. I don't know if they have laser eyes. The Fed also sets up rules for banks, although these can also be set by Congress. But the most important thing the Fed does is loan money to other banks and set interest rates. That's why when you hear about the Federal Reserve, 9 times out of 10, it's about interest rates, because that's the main way the Fed controls the money supply. The Fed loans money to banks, sweet, sweet money, which they in turn loan out to businesses and individuals. And like all loans, the Fed charges interest. The Fed sets the rate on the interest, called the discount rate, and this determines mostly how much money banks will borrow. The lower the rate, the more banks will borrow, and the more money goes into circulation. Other banks peg the interest rates they charge to the Fed's rate, charging slightly more. So in this way, the Fed determines or sets interest rates in the economy as a whole. The Fed also creates regulations that control how much money circulates in the economy. One of these is the bank reserve requirement, or the amount of money in cash that a bank has to have on hand. Now, the amount of money that a bank holds in reserve is only a fraction of the total amount of money held in deposit at the bank. That's why it's called fractional reserve banking. But the reserve requirement is there so that you don't get catastrophic bank runs like we saw during the Great Depression, when so many frightened depositors took their money out of the banks. The banks fail. Raising the reserve requirement reduces the amount of money in circulation, and lowering it pumps more money into the economy. The Federal Reserve also sets the interest rate banks charge to lend money to each other, which again controls the amount of money that circulates. If banks are charging each other a lot of money to borrow, they won't borrow as much, and they won't lend as much to firms and individuals, and there will be less money in the economy as a whole. There's at least one more important way that the Fed influences the money supply in the U.S., and that's through open market operations. This is a fancy way to say that the Fed buys and sells government debt in the form of treasury bills or government bonds. When the Fed sells bonds, it takes money out of the economy, and when it buys them, more money goes into the economy. This is the idea behind what is known as quantitative easing, which is really complicated. To be honest, I'm not crazy about wading into economics here, and thankfully there's a whole other series to do that. But I have to mention inflation at this point. Inflation is a general rise in prices that can be caused by a number of things, but one of them is the amount of money that circulates. If there's more money around, there's more that can be spent, and this makes it possible for prices to go up. But this isn't an absolute rule. As of 2016, we've had years of basically zero interest rates, which means it's really cheap to borrow money, which means that there should be a lot of money in circulation, yet inflation remains quite low. Hey, still cheap to borrow money. Can I borrow $2? No? Never had any money. Usually, low interest rates tend to cause inflation and reduce unemployment, and high interest rates are expected to cool down an overheating economy, but that hasn't happened much in the past few years. I'll say again, I'm glad this isn't an economic series. It's important to note here that the Federal Reserve is an independent body, meaning that its board of governors and chairperson are not elected or really subject to much regulation from Congress. And they throw the best parties. That's probably probably why. This is intentional and probably a good idea. Ideally, you want people in charge of the money supply to be able to look after broader interests than their own re-election. And this is why the Fed is supposed to be insulated from politics and remain independent. Okay, so that's monetary policy, which is one lever that the federal government can use to influence the economy. Increasingly, it's the only lever because in America, we have a hard time with fiscal policy. What's that, you might be asking? Fiscal policy refers to the government's ability to raise taxes and spend the money it raises. Since I know that by this episode you've been paying a lot of attention to American politics, you know that in the past 20 or 30 years at least, Americans have generally been reluctant to raise taxes and somewhat reluctant to have the government spend money. The difference between these two goals, spending money and not raising taxes, largely explains why we have deficits. Before we get into tax policy, which I know is what you've been waiting for, calm down, I need to point out that the way the government can spend more money on programs than it takes in taxes is by borrowing it, which the government does by, you guessed it, selling bonds. Good thing we talked about open market operations. Let's tax the thought cafe people with a lot of work by talking about taxes and spending in the thought bubble. First, ever since Ronald Reagan came to office, there has been a hostility towards higher taxes and government spending that is theoretically based in an idea called supply-side economics. I'm not going to discuss the details of the theory or even whether it's right or wrong or somewhere in between, but the basic thrust is that if you lower taxes on businesses and individuals, the individuals will be able to spend more, the businesses will be able to invest more, and the economy as a whole will grow. It's a simple and politically powerful idea and has set the terms of the debate for a generation. In general, over the past 30 years, the trend is for there to be lower federal taxes and for them to be less progressive, meaning that wealthier people pay a lower percentage of their income in federal taxes. The wealthy still pay the largest share of federal taxes overall, though, so it's not completely accurate to say that they aren't paying. Since Reagan, and especially during the presidency of George W. Bush, income tax rates on the highest earners have fallen, as have taxes on estates, although they did go up again, and on capital gains and dividends. President Obama did raise taxes, but primarily on people earning about $450,000 a year. Corporate tax rates have also declined, and Social Security taxes have gone up, which is important because this is the federal tax that most of us are most likely to pay. Overall, the percentage of revenue that the federal government receives from taxes has held pretty steady at between 43% and 50%. If you're interested in the numbers, for 2013, the government received almost $2.8 trillion in tax revenue, and it spent $3.5 trillion, which math tells us means a deficit of around $700 billion. Thanks, Thought Bubble. When people say that they need to cut spending and balance the budget, this is what they're talking about. But it's not quite as simple as just spending less, because there are some places where the government can't cut spending, even if they want to. There are certain items in the federal budget that must be spent because they are written into law by Congress. These are called uncontrollables or mandatory spending. One uncontrollable that relates to monetary policy is interest payments on federal debt. The government can't not pay its interest. Otherwise, no one would lend us money. That's just how lending works. Or it's supposed to work. Farm price supports, subsidies, are also counted as uncontrollables, and they are important, but not nearly as important as the two big-ticket mandatory spending items. These are Social Security and Medicare. They're paid for with dedicated federal taxes. They provide income and health insurance for elderly people, and it's unlikely that the amounts the government spends on them is going to decline anytime soon for three reasons. First is that the population is aging, meaning that the percentage of older Americans is rising in proportion to younger Americans. This means that more people will be receiving Social Security payments, which leads us to the second reason they are unlikely to go down. People like them. The third reason is more political. Older people tend to vote more regularly, so a politician who wants to keep their job is unlikely to vote for cuts in Social Security or Medicare. So here's the thing about the Federal Reserve and economics. The American economy is really huge and really complicated, and it has some issues that need addressing. Whether you care a lot about budget deficits or don't think they're a big deal will depend a lot on your feelings about economics in general, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First, there's only a limited range of programs on which the government can choose to spend or not spend. These are called discretionary spending. When people call for cuts in government spending, this is what they mean. By far, the largest chunk of government spending goes into defense, over $600 billion in 2013. But the next largest item is healthcare for the poor, Medicaid, at $498 billion. Nothing else even comes close. Spending on the Department of Education, for example, was $41 billion in 2013. The second thing to bear in mind is that in addition to cutting spending, the government could balance its budget by doing what everyone loves, raising taxes. It's done this on occasion, but the political consequences can be pretty tough. Just ask George H.W. Bush. Finally, the combination of Americans' aversion to raising taxes and the government's limited ability to cut spending means that monetary policy becomes its major lever in broad-based macroeconomic policy. That's why we paid so much attention to the Federal Reserve System at the beginning of this episode, and why you probably should too. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. Support for Crash Course U.S. Government comes from Vocal. Vocal supports nonprofits that use technology and media to advance social equity. Learn more.
A lot of good information there, especially about the Federal Reserve. You've also got plenty of other, if you go to their the Crash Course website on YouTube, tons of other videos that are similar that can help with all sorts of stuff like things that we're talking about. Any impressions from seeing that? Well, two things I hope everybody got out of that. One is the idea of discretionary spending compared to the second thing, which is mandatory spending. Mandatory spending items can't be touched. So what does the government really end up with? That's the big issue for Congress when they start to talk about a budget. So where does the government money come from? If you look at this pie chart here from 2015, oops. It's 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. Federal tax revenue from 2015 was $3.18 trillion. There's not obviously dollars visible on the chart, but if you take your mouse and hover over it, there's where you're going to get the detail. In the video, the guy just talked about having income tax revenue, federal tax revenue ranging between 43 and 50% of the federal budget every year. Well, for 2015, it was 46.5%, 1.48 trillion. Payroll taxes, another trillion. Corporate income taxes, 341, basically 0.7 billion, 10.76% of the overall budget. Now, the big thing here, look how big this individual income tax slice of the pie is. Compare that to the green of corporate income tax. Now, if you're listening to the current debate in America about taxation, there's a lot of sentiment for increasing corporate income taxes. What typically happens if corporate income taxes are raised? If they raise the tax on corporations like Amazon or McDonald's, how do the corporations react? They're going to raise their prices. Just said we spend more. Well, that's exactly what happens on the consumer side of it. We will end up spending more money because the corporations they're not going to reduce their profit margin to cover the taxes. They're just going to raise the price of their product so that they can cover most or all of that increased tax load. Corporations also are very active in the political arena with donations and influencing decisions and that sort of thing. So politicians, being politicians, they want to get reelected. They need the kind of corporate support that's available through businesses. If you've ever heard the phrase, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, that's where you can see it coming into play in our political system also. Corporate donors, other large donors have a big influence on individual or collective political activity. Excise taxes, not very much. Customs, here I went to customs. Oh, miscellaneous, 158 billion, excise, 96 billion. Customs, 36 billion, not very much money coming in from those other sources. Anything surprise you about that pie chart? So I would encourage you guys to look at all these links. Federal budget 2016 is another one. This one I like because of those boxes below the pie charts there that talk about categories of the budget: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, net interest. Oh, where's net interest? Look at this. 13% of gross domestic product goes to pay interest on our borrowing. The numbers here on the income side are going to be a little bit different than that last graphic because it's a year later. You also switched. See, 2016 would have been the last year of the Obama presidency before the election. So this would have been sort of their last, that party's last budget before the election in 2016, where Donald Trump was elected. This link also has this nice graphic here about federal deficits, 1967 to 2016. Wow, between 97 and 2002, it looks like we had a surplus. A little tiny surplus there after 1967. Mostly in the hole, though, in a deficit situation. So if you just take the revenues and you try to subtract the amount that's being spent, you're going to get a negative number. That's why we call it, it's why it goes into deficit spending. And consequently, here's how the U.S. federal debt has grown during that same period of time. They're showing this as a percentage of gross domestic product. Anybody know what gross domestic product refers to? I would encourage you to look these up, because there's two terms here that are relevant for this. They sound the same. Gross domestic product compared to gross national product. It'd be good to know what both of those refer to. And I'll show you the first place I would go. If you're not familiar with Investopedia, for a course like this, be a good idea to bookmark it, because it's all about economic terms. And you can do search with it. Gross domestic product. GDP, gross domestic product. The monetary value of all finished goods and services made within a country during a specific period. Now, GDP is one of these measurements that economists use to compare economies. And then they'll rank countries around the world based on the production amounts. A high gross domestic product implies that you're selling you're within your country. You have a high monetary value of all finished goods and services. Gross national product, further down on the screen, the value, national product is the value of all finished goods and services owned by a country's residents over a period of time. So if your company is based in America, but you have locations all around the world, the value of all the things that your company produces goes into gross national product. Some of it will be in gross domestic product if it's created here in America. But if it's created in England or India or Vietnam, those dollars are going to count towards gross national product, but not gross domestic product. So two really good terms to get comfortable with that directly relate to the topics that we're looking at right now. This last set of pie charts, let's see, this is 2012, and I've not been able to find a more current one than this. But I like these kind of charts because they can help you with perceptions right away without even really having to know all the detail. So income over here, and these are all being shown in percentages. Our outlays would be expenditures. So the highest category of income, and it doesn't matter which one of these charts we've looked at, the highest category of income has always been personal income taxes. Who pays personal income taxes? We do, you and me. You got a job, you pay personal income tax. You might get it, you know, if you don't make much money, you might get it all refunded. But it comes out of your paycheck every week or every 2 weeks. You're paying taxes whether you realize it or not. 32% in 2012. The next highest, borrowing to cover the deficit, 30%. 30% to cover the deficit. The next highest, Social Security, Medicare, unemployment, and other retirement taxes, 24%. Well, at 24%, it's pretty much untouchable money. It's a huge number, but it has to go for those things. Those are not discretionary. Those are the mandatory spending items that Congress has to deal with. It have to be written into the budget every year. There's your corporate income taxes, 7% again, fairly low, similar to that other pie chart. And then excise and all other types of taxes also about 7%. So 62% from personal income taxes and borrowing. That's almost 2/3 of the federal budget just from those two categories. Over on the outlay side, look at the largest expenditure area, that big gray slice. Social Security, Medicare, and other retirement, 38%. 24%, national defense, veterans, foreign affairs. Social programs, 21%. What might be under social programs? Guys think of any examples? You guys know what AFDC is? You know what Section 8 housing is? Those are social programs. AFDC, aid to families with dependent children. Welfare, those are social programs. The kind of social programs that, and this could be another thing that you could write the president about in your letter. I'm not going to send these to the president, so don't worry about that. I have done that before, but I didn't do it without anybody's consent. I did it making sure everybody knew that that's what we were going to do. And I never got a response, so I don't know what happened to this. I packaged them all up and sent it to President Obama. It probably just went to the round file as soon as they got to the White House. But social programs, you know, are we doing enough to help people that are less fortunate? Are we helping the homeless enough? You know, what's another big crisis in America right now, and especially been highlighted during the pandemic? Opioid addiction. Are we doing enough to help people that are struggling with addiction? Probably not. Judging from the numbers that keep going up and the overdoses, you know, maybe more needs to be done to help people steer clear of that kind of stuff and stay away from it and stay sober, stay clean. Physical, human, and community development, 9%. Net interest on the debt, 6%. So is that how the government should be spending its money? Spending our money? You know, that's what you're going to have to decide. Okay, should be one more link here. If it, hopefully it still works. Oh, here's a even greater detail on the 2016 budget. $1.369 trillion for Social Security. Medicare and Health, $1.106 trillion. Education, $78.9 billion. You know, $1 billion is a lot of money. But compared to the federal budget, that's hardly anything. That's 2% of the federal budget. So is that enough? I mean, is that something that we should be concerned about long term? That's the kind of stuff that we all as citizens will end up having to deal with at some point, even if it's just dealing with it philosophically in how we vote. They got questions so far about any of that?
No, yeah.
Okay. So here's the part about GDP that's relevant. So it's another one of the handouts in that section. GDP in trillions of dollars. Does this have the year in it? This is probably 4 or 5 years old now. United States was leading the way worldwide. And what do you notice about this list? Look at the countries that are at the top. United States, China, Japan, India, Italy, Mexico, South Korea. Canada down in 14th. Every country in the world is ranked on this. Look at Sierra Leone. You know where Sierra Leone is? No. It's in Africa. Tiny, tiny little country. Guyana, another tiny little country. Suriname, I believe that's in the Southeast Asia area. Fiji, tiny, tiny little island out in that vicinity. So we're not going to do this particular exercise, but if you took the population, People's Republic of China, if you wanted to know how much GDP per capita means per person. If you took this $10,119,896 and divided it by the population, that would tell you each individual person's share of that gross domestic product. That's what the value of it would be. China has a lot more people than the United States. So per person, the value is going to be higher in the US than it will be in China. India, hugely populated country. Large GDP, but you divide that amongst more people, that individual share goes down. And these kind of calculations are typical of what a lot of economists deal with. The other thing about this particular handout, Fiscal and Monetary Policy GDP per capita, if you look down here on these next pages, this is a good note sheet. Make yourself a copy of this. Remember how to do that. You want to go up here to File, make a copy, change the name, file it, save it to your Google Drive. And you can use it for notes. Because here it's asking about what is inflation. List one cause of inflation. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, define those in your own words, things that we talked about, things you're going to be tested on. You know, the thing is, guys, about this class, especially this class, there's no way you're going to be able to get through this just by sitting here every 2 days and listening. You're going to have to take some notes. You can't possibly remember everything that we talked about or that gets shown on a video. Taking the notes will help you organize it and help you remember it better. The last page here, which I find especially interesting. What benefits does the government provide me? What do I get from all that government tax money? Well, me personally, I'm happy that we have a nice interstate system that allows me to drive from Indianapolis to Florida with relatively few interruptions or stops. I'm not currently getting any assistance on medical, but in a few years when I retire, medical's private still, although insurance is required and there are government insurance programs. So if you can't get insurance, a lot of people get insurance through their employer. But if you can't, then you probably need to sign up on one of these government assistance insurance programs. So yeah, that's a good example, medical insurance. And you guys in this room or on the Zoom right now, you're benefiting today from government spending. Are you paying for this schooling? No. Who's paying for it? In Indiana, schools are supported by property taxes. Every state's different, but property taxes in Indiana go to large, that's the largest source of funding for education in Indiana, is through property taxes. So if you're a property owner, you own a house, you're helping to support education. Now, there are some states like Arizona, for instance, that has had trouble paying for their education systems over the years because they have a lot of retired people. They have a lot of people that own property, but they don't have very many kids. So they're like, hey, I'm not sending kids to school. I don't need to pay for that. Well, again, it sort of comes back to what kind of society are we choosing to live in, and how do we support the people that are here and might be here in the future? Because remember the definition, go back to that original definition of economics. Day one, it's goods and services for present and future consumption. What kind of choices are we going to make? And this whole, all these exercises surrounding the federal budgeting and that sort of stuff, it gets directly at that question. What choices are we going to make? What spending choices are there going to be out there that reflect what we believe about our society? Every country is different. So let me go to the last section in there. The last handout in there talks about the business cycle. This is also in one of the other handouts about the Great Depression. So these terms are four that you should know. And this graphic here, this business cycle graphic, is one that most economists agree with. It looks like a wave, right? A wave has a crest. Waves have a trough. The crest is the top, the trough is the bottom. So on the way up, the economy is expanding. On the way down, it's contracting. What we don't want is to stay in this trough for any length of time, because then we bottom out. The economy is not doing anything. It's not growing. It's just stagnant. And that's kind of what happened for the 10 years of the Great Depression. We stayed in this trough largely. The last 2 pages of this is an excellent description of our government's real job. What are they supposed to do? 6 things. Five things. Provide the economy with a legal structure. Okay, so people can't get cheated. There's laws governing transactions. You got to maintain competition. Can't have monopolies. Can't have just one company that controls everything. The government's job also is to redistribute income. That's what Social Security can be. That's what some of these social programs involve. We all pay taxes that maybe we don't even benefit from any of those programs. But as a society, we've chosen to help people that are less fortunate. Government's got to provide public or quasi-public goods like education, security, police, that sort of thing. And then finally, promoting growth and stability. That's what's been happening in the last several months through the pandemic. The government's trying to stabilize the economy with these incentive and stimulus packages and that sort of thing. So really good read there to give you more background on what the overall role of government should be. And that, I believe, is everything in that particular link under role of government. We covered all 4 of those documents. We didn't even get to talk about supply and demand yet. We'll do that on Thursday. So any questions, anybody?
Nope.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording and we'll see everybody Thursday. I'll be around tomorrow. If you need help on anything, just let me know.
We'll be here tomorrow.
Okay, bye. See you Tuesday.